Hello there. I want to apologize to those of you who were really interested in watching the video of the last Q&A coaching call, and I really appreciate your patience in waiting for this video. As I mentioned in the Facebook page, the topic in particular conversation that came up for one of our participants for the most recent call was one that they just weren't comfortable having recorded because of personal and political considerations that the word getting out there would be not so great. So in the spirit of courageousness and confidentiality. So some really interesting themes came out in the conversation, and really it was about primarily what happens when intense people are in relationship with other intense people, and how can we manage relationship, particularly when we as the individual are sort of self-aware enough that we're thinking about this stuff and working on management of it, but we're really not sure what's going on in the other person's head, and they're not demonstrating the social, emotional, and relationship intelligence that it would be nice to see from people. So that's the biggest theme that I'm going to talk about. But before I dive into that, one of the things that came up was the question of what does it mean to thrive? I have been explicitly ambiguous about thrive, in that I have not actually defined thriving for any of us. And I haven't even asked you to define what thriving means for you. I've trusted that you have a gut instinct about what thriving means for you. And really, that's what matters to me. Now, one of the things as a coach, that's my job. My job is to set aside any agenda that I have in service of my clients' agendas. And so I just assume that your definition of thrive is your definition of thrive, and that's what matters. But conversation did come up. There's this sense out in large places of the positive psychology world, and coaching is in many ways applied positive psychology, that thriving means positive emotions, always feeling happy, never feeling negative, always being enthusiastic and alive and happy. And in fact, Martin Seligman, who was the sort of prime instigator for the movement of positive psychology in the modern world, wrote a book called Authentic Happiness. And it turns out he hates the title of the book, and he never liked it anyway, but really happiness was the word there, and it was really focused on feeling positive emotions. And what's happened in the US is this has gotten connected to the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness kind of mythos of what success is, why there's this whole country that existed, positive feelings. And Seligman has written a book called Flourish, which is another word I like. It's less popular than thrive, but it's in that same arena, flourish. Actually, what people do for its own sake, not as a means to an end, in the way of flourishing, is more than just feeling positive emotions. And there's been a bunch of stuff out in the pop psychology world over the last probably 5 years about how a sense of meaning is more important for at least some people than a sense of happiness, those positive emotions. Seligman took this question of sort of what it is to flourish, what is mental well-being, feeling good about the life that you're living, like what are the independent components that are part of it. And he identified 5 components that pretty much 4 of them function very much independently of each other. The 5th is sort of fundamental and tied into all of them, but also something independent in and of itself. And for every individual, the balance between these different elements about what makes one feel good about one's life is slightly different. But for most people, well-being actually includes a reasonable level of satisfaction in each of these areas. So the first of these is feeling positive emotions, feeling happy, joy, glad, ecstasy, whatever, like the positive emotions. The one is that it feels good in the moment to have, the pleasure piece. The second is sort of engagement, sort of interest, enthusiasm, just a sense of like, I want to be here, which is different than happiness. It's a sense of, yeah, let's go. I'm here in the moment, alive. The third is a sense of meaning or purpose, a sense that what I'm doing matters. Now, the sense of meaning is interesting because you can either feel like something is meaningful. There's a qualitative aspect to, right now it feels like what I'm doing matters. And that's part of the sense of meaning. But the other part of meaning is I intellectually, cognitively go, you know what, this matters. This is a principle that I'm standing for, that I am acting towards, that matters to me. And so this is really interesting. There's both that cognitive and qualitative aspect to meaning and purpose. The next element is achievement. This is achievement for its own sake. This is winning the card game because you like winning. This is making so much money because it feels like I set out to make this much money and I made this much money. This is I auditioned for a role and I got it. This is I got applause at the end of a speech. This is like achievement for its own sake, that I did it. And then the 5th is relationships, meaningful, positive, connected relationships. And the thing about relationships is that relationships are tied to positive emotions, engagement, meaning, and achievement in a way that the other pieces aren't tied to each other. So PERMA is the little mnemonic that Seligman uses. Positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement are the elements of well-being. So in the sense of thriving with intensity, if you're not feeling like you're thriving, if you're not feeling like your well-being is where you want it to be, one of the things you can look at is there one of those that's more out of balance than the others? And if so, it's time to put some effort in those. So it's not just having positive emotions. And this is really, really important for intense people, for emotionally intense people in particular, because those negative emotions or awkward emotions or mixed emotions feel so rich and full that they can be overwhelming, and there can be so much judgment if you have the sense of, I should be feeling happy all the time. But actually, often things that feel meaningful, oftentimes where we have really connected relationships, aren't actually also accompanied by positive emotions. Achievement often comes as a result of hard work, which is uncomfortable. So, meaning, purpose, achievement, relationships, sometimes you have to sacrifice the short-term pleasurable option in order to get them. And well-being includes balancing all those elements. So, with that said, one of the elements of well-being is relationship. And relationship was a huge theme of the conversation last week. And how does intensity impact relationships? And so I'm just going to go through a bunch of things that may or may not be really well connected to each other to just drop some ideas in, and I encourage conversation in the Facebook group, in our next content call, in future Q&A coaching calls on these themes, or just reach out to me personally and talk to me, because I love to talk about relationships. They're sort of the bread and butter of my passion. So intensity impacts relationships in lots of ways. One of the biggest things is that there's a tendency for intense people to be very, very sensitive to rejection or perceived rejection. And this really happens in particular in the emotional, intellectual, and imaginational realms. The emotional level is that rejection just hurts more. Rejection hurts like physical pain for everybody. It just hurts more if you're sensitive. So rejection hurts more. Intellectual fastness about analysis of, oh, I've been rejected, I've been disagreed with, I've had my ideas shut down. Why? Like, you can justify that. If you are intellectually excitable, you are going to justify and find reasons to justify that feeling of hurt. And so you can reinforce that sense of rejection, making it worse. And if you have strong imaginational overexcitabilities, you are imagining all the things that they think about you that they didn't say. And you're projecting into the future how this is going to be the way it is all the way along the line. And so deep sensitivity to rejection. So learning to manage our own emotional reactions in the face of rejection or perceived rejection, disagreement, disharmony is really, really powerful, because it gives us freedom. I have mentioned, I think in this group, I mentioned it in enough places that I've forgotten where I mentioned it. One of my favorite books that I read last year, I actually listened to the audiobook, and I listened to it about 4 times in a row. I liked it so much. It's called The Courage to Be Disliked. It's actually about how is it that you stand up and let yourself be in that discomfort of being rejected and still move forward. There's another little book out there called Rejection Proof, which is a really interesting little story of someone who experimented with getting rejected as many times as possible on a regular basis in order to get over being derailed by rejection. One of the things that happens because of our sensitivity to rejection as intense people is we are more likely than average to listen in a way that is formulating a response that is defending ourselves then, and not as a way of listening for understanding. Because we're afraid that if we understand them, we're going to understand that they are making us wrong and bad and right, and we don't want that. If we are intellectually excitable and imaginationally excitable, we are also going down all the paths to all the stories about how that's going to happen. And so learning to listen in conversation in a way that we really understand people without giving up our right to what it is we feel, what it is we think, to defend ourselves, is really powerful again. So a couple of things about listening. We need to trust that we can listen to understand and still be able to defend ourselves. And there's a lovely exercise that is really powerful for this. For lots of us, there's this fear that if we really, really listen to somebody and they finish what they're saying, that we're not actually going to have answers. We're not actually going to have a response. We're going to be slow to think. We're not going to know what we're going to say, and we're going to get derailed in the conversation. For most of us, that's just not true. And an exercise that we can use that will help us learn that is voice mirroring. So voice mirroring is just saying in your head what the person you're listening to is saying as close to when they're saying it as possible. So while you're watching this video, you can actually practice using your outside voice. You can actually spend some time with me trying to say the words that I'm saying as close to when I'm saying them as possible. Now, it feels really funny and it can be hard at first, but what I want you to be aware of is when you stop voice mirroring, do you have your own ideas? Do you have your own thoughts? Are you prepared to say something in response? Most of us have fast enough processing speed that we do not need to worry about formulating our response before the other person has stopped speaking in order to get into the lull in the conversation. If we do actually have a slow enough processing speed that we can't do that, then it's worth knowing that, because then we can preemptively say when there's a lull in the conversation, interesting, give me a moment to think about it. And then we can do the thinking, and then we can do the responding. It may feel like voice mirroring actually gets in the way of listening, because listening feels weird if you're doing that, if you haven't done it before. There's a way of attending that just feels different. It's a different cognitive thing inside. But when we do this, it actually turns out that we hear and understand better, even if it doesn't feel like we're processing it cognitively while we're just doing the mechanics of mirroring the voice. Consciousness is weird. I know I've said weird several times, but it's just odd. It isn't all of what we know. And so we often know things in a way that is not reflected in our consciousness of what we know. So slowing down our responsiveness by voice mirroring is a way of practicing a different way of taking in information. It helps us keep our focus on the other person, which gets us out of our own egos. When we're thinking about our responses, when we're listening to someone, we're wrapped up in our own egos, we get wrapped up in our own fears, and we're more likely to answer from a defended position than we are from an open and honest position. So if we act from a defended position, we're more likely to sound like we're attacking. We're more likely to actually be attacking. Then if they're sensitive and intense, they're more likely to feel attacked, more likely to attack back. Drama, not so much understanding, not so much connection. Another way to get out of our own heads while we're listening is to listen beyond and around the words that you're hearing. So one of the things about smart, intellectually overexcitable people is that when we're listening, the words may not be taking up all of our conscious capacity and all of our cognitive capacity. The complexity of what we're taking in, our brains are like, so what else is there for me to pay attention to? And it's very easy for us to pay attention to what's going on in our body, what's going on in our minds in response. If we expand what we are listening to or listening for in terms of understanding the other person, We can make our minds busier so that there's less extra cognitive capacity trying to figure out what to do with itself. So if we listen to the precise words, really trying to understand the actual facts and context and concepts that are being delivered by the precise words, and then also trying to listen for what's not being said, what's in the tone of voice, how does this person feel about this, what else is in their experience, their world, that might be relevant here. Putting your focus over there while you're listening. Because it really is a gift to ourselves to get out of our own egos if we're sensitive. Because it's when we're in our egos that we become sensitive to rejection. So when we put our focus over there and wait to have heard them, listened to them, understood them before we respond from our own position, it's a gift to the entire relationship. They feel heard in a way that people often don't feel heard. And most of us crave being heard and seen. And so actually listening that way creates that experience for other people. And we get out of our own stuff. Win-win. Now, we don't have to agree with what they say and give up our right to disagree with them and defend ourselves against things that feel like we're going to give up something if we don't respond to what they say. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. I'm not going to sort of go right there right now. One of the things that hooks us a lot, because we want to be heard and seen, is when other people don't get us, when other people don't understand us, when we want connection and it's not there, we can get very emotional, very compelled. There's real power in accepting that because of our complexities and our intensities, there are a lot of people who won't get it or won't get us, who won't understand us with the level of complexity that we want, with the level of knowing, understanding that we want. We want to be seen fully, and they'll just get bits and pieces of us and they'll misunderstand us. So we need to acknowledge that we want that and acknowledge that nobody's ever going to get us with the level of understanding that we get ourselves. They're always going to miss something. And the more complex we are, the more people are going to miss us. For lots of reasons. One is there's a really steep learning curve to understand us. Even if we put all of ourselves out there bravely and courageously, we can only put a little bit of ourselves into the space as a focus at any given time. And so people don't know us beyond that. So if I meet somebody, and let's say we're at a theater and I'm talking theater, over the course of an evening, they will probably figure out that I know a lot about theater. They will probably figure out that I've made theater, that I've been an actor and director. They will probably discover something about some of the kinds of shows that I like. But maybe not. It's hard to tell. My breadth of understanding of theater is quite broad. I like some really edgy avant-garde stuff. I like some really mainstream stuff. What I care about is kind of weird. Specific to me, I have real sensitivity and, dare I say it, taste around preferences. And they could learn a bunch about me, but they're not going to learn anything about the kind of fiction that I read, the kind of TV shows that I watch, the fact that I have kids who are into some unusual sports, and every time I introduce my kids to an unusual sport, I watch them and I'm like, I want to know what that feels like in my body. And they certainly aren't going to learn about my history of dyeing my hair all sorts of weird colors, and the weird music that I listened to when I was 10 and 11. And like, there's not enough time in an evening. There's not enough time in years. If we have surface conversations, I can spend an entire season hanging out at the rink with my daughter's ringette team parents and have them know very little about me and still feel like I've been sharing things about me all season long. Right? So there's a very steep learning curve for other people to learn about the nuances of us complex people. And vice versa, there's a very steep learning curve for us to learn about other people. We're sensitive to nuance. So when people sort of get a sense of who we are and they feel like they've got enough complexity for now, we feel like, but you're missing all that stuff. Like, really? Like, you haven't actually quite understood me. In the areas that we care about, particularly people who have intellectual overexcitabilities, the things that we care about, we know a lot of stuff. So we might struggle with sort of levels of knowledge and levels of knowledge. The other thing that happens with people who have intellectual overexcitabilities is huge amounts of random trivia that we know. They're sort of collecting pieces of information from all over everywhere and pull them up into conversations. And other people are like, I didn't know that. Where did that go? How do I make the pieces connect? And if we're in conversation with somebody else who is also intellectually overexcitable and has picked up an entirely different set of random facts, actually coming to understanding of each other takes a huge amount of time, and we were never going to get it complete. So not only are we not going to be understood, we're not going to understand fully either. And so we actually have to accept that there is mystery in every relationship. We are misunderstood. We will be misunderstood. There's nothing wrong with that. We can have the desire to always be deepening that without actually having success. But we need to learn to calm our own sense of aloneness, to live with that, to feel the wonder and the mystery of always having more to discover about somebody else, and manage our own emotions. The other thing that happens is that if we're emotionally demonstrative and other people are uncomfortable with or sensitive to emotions, we have to be careful about their overwhelm, not in a way that sort of says we have to hold ourselves back, but we have to notice when they go into overwhelm. If they are flooded, they are no longer paying attention to who we are, seeing who we are, and we are going to be misunderstood. So we might as well just not force the issue at that point. So building our capacity to be disliked, to be misunderstood, that's really powerful. Now, part of the counter to that is to find the people who do get us. Find the people who get you most. Stay with them, hang out with them, embrace them, turn to them all the time, because they are treasures. Because there are huge swaths of the population that aren't going to have enough overlap with you to sort of really understand the breadth of who you are. And that's not bad or wrong. It's just not always comfortable. And if we crave deep emotional connection, we have to find the balancing that is leaning into the connection, finding where the limits are, and leaning into other connections differently. When we interact with other people out of our own fears, it has an impact on us, on them, on the relationship. A couple of things happen when we're afraid. One is that we get defensive in response to things that they say. When we get defensive, one of the things that we need to learn to do is to recognize our own defensive behaviors. They're somewhere in the fight, flight, freeze realm. You might argue back, you might disappear and withdraw, you might do both, you might just sort of go along to get along. You might have a complicated mix of them, and it might be different topics or different people that push you in the different directions. Get to know your own responses. The nice thing about being intense is that your responses are probably pretty obvious. Get to know your own responses, and then get curious about your responses. When you notice yourself reacting to something defensively, there's some questions to ask. What am I defending myself against? What am I afraid of? And then a couple of really interesting questions. What unmet expectation is underneath my reaction? When we complain or defend, there's often an unarticulated expectation or dream of how we want the world to be that is not being met by reality. And that there's a grief, a loss in that gap between our expectations and our dreams and what's real. And we need to honor that gap. We need to honor the sadness and the grief that lives in that gap, because our expectations were reality for us. That's part of our lived experience. And then what's actually real and possible is what it is, and there's nothing we can do about it. We can't actually change what is. We can't actually change what's possible in this moment. We might actually be able to work from it, work with it, mold it, but the gap between what we want to be and what is, we have a response to it, and we need to honor it, bring it into consciousness, and then we can hold the paradox. This is how it is, and this is how I would have liked it to have been different. And I'm going to choose to be with how it is, because that's where I'm effective. That's where I can get into achievement. That's where I can have meaningful relationships. That's where I can actually get things done. And this is where choosing the meaningful and the real over the short-term positive emotion can be really powerful. Another thing that happens that often makes us defensive or pushy or pushing back is when there's something that we believe in, something that we value, something that we put real importance on, that we feel is being skipped over or stepped on or not respected. When we honor that we have things that feel important to us that are not being respected, there's another place where there's sadness and grief. And there can be compassion and meaningful relationships in honoring that. Because one of the things that's really funny about the word needs in the way that we talk about psychological needs is that actually they are needs, in that in order to feel like 100% whole and great and happy, they need to be met, but also they're wants more than needs in a lot of ways. Like food, drink, those are not wants, right? There's a level of physical sustenance that is actually a need. All of the other psychological needs that we have, they're never fully met. They're never fully met. That's the human predicament, is that they are needs and they are never fully met. And so there's always a gap. There's always the yearning. There's always the wanting. There's always that discomfort. And when we honor that, letting ourselves hold the reality of our disappointment lightly, then it's possible to get meaningful relationships, meaningful connection, a sense of meaning and purpose in soothing that often. And it really impacts our relationships. It really impacts our ability to be human with each other, to be real with each other, and to be effective with each other without unnecessary drama. Speaking of unnecessary drama, one of the things that happens a lot when we get hooked emotionally and we're in our defensive places is that we backhandedly attack other people's positions. And I'm pretty sure I've talked about the ladder of inference in this group. I'm just going to go over it for those of you who have forgotten, or in case I haven't. But fundamentally, we start with data. That is our bodily experience of the world, the perceptions that we have of the world. Somewhere out there is a world that exists that is not quite what we perceive. We know from studying animals that they have ways of perceiving the world that means that they're aware of details that we're not aware of. So there's a thing out there called the world, and then there's what we become aware of because we have the sensory apparatus to pick up on that data. And then there's the data that we filter out as important. And then we take that data and then we have meaning that we ascribe to it, and stories that we ascribe to it, and judgments and beliefs, and that's climbing up the ladder. Every time we layer one of those things, then we're climbing up the ladder. And eventually we're like, okay, now let's make a decision and take an action. Somewhere in that decision-making, problem-solving place is where most of us live when we're having conversations with other people. And when somebody says something that hooks us, typically what's happening is that they've climbed up one ladder and we've climbed up one ladder, and from here they've said something that is like conflicting with some belief we have in here. And so what we often do is we backhandedly attack their beliefs. And then they get mad and defensive because we've attacked them. They attack back, drama. Much better relationship approach is to notice, oh, I've been hooked and I'm tempted to attack their beliefs. Let's get curious about how we think. What ladder are they on? What ladder am I on? Because they're not actually talking about facts. They're talking about their beliefs. And I'm talking about my beliefs. So you can ask direct questions, courageous direct questions about their thought process. How did you get there? Walk me through your thinking. Unpacking their beliefs. You might have some good questions to get you there. Also, you can share your own ladder. Here's how I thought. Here are the things that I know that are impacting the way I'm thinking. Now, sometimes you're not aware of that, your thought process. The faster you go up the ladder, the less likely it is that you're conscious of that. One of the ways self-awareness develops is that you start to develop to wake up your ladder. And the other person may not be aware of their thinking process either. So actually you might struggle to go down the ladder sort of, but you can say, what are the facts we agree on? Like, what's the bigger picture we agree on? What's the data that we think we're working with? What are the facts that we can agree on? Because when you see each other's ladders, one of the things that becomes possible is that you can recognize their inner authority and your own inner authority and say, oh, look, here's the ladder you walked up. Here's the ladder I walked up. Your ladder makes sense. Then you can say, I disagree with this judgment, this interpretation, because I believe this. or because I have this extra fact that I'm considering that feels important and relevant to me. And this is the thing that makes it possible to respect each other, honor each other, listen to each other, and disagree with each other without defending each other. Because you can honor, this is your ladder, and this is my ladder. And neither of those needs to be wrong. They can both be partially right. They can both be partially wrong. An interesting question to ask is, what is the 2% of you that sort of believes their line of thinking? What is the 2%? Are you 2% wrong? Am I 2% wrong? How are they 2% right? That's the place that you can find alignment. Now, one of the things that emotionally sensitive people want is they don't like disagreeing with each other. And so they want harmony. They want a sense of being in alignment with each other. And so there's this craving often for working with people. And often this turns into a sense of either you're with me or you're against me. Sensitivity to rejection, right? So working with somebody requires having a sense of alignment on something and a common goal. Now, alignment can come with disagreement. You can have a bigger picture that you're aligned on and then disagree on some of the details. You might have a common goal of raising happy, healthy children with your spouse. And you might have some real disagreements about what makes people happy and healthy and what balance sort of short-term happiness and long-term health should have in relationship with each other. You might have very different senses of what that PERMA collection of well-being is, and if my sense is it needs to have a lot of meaning, a reasonable amount of positive emotions, lots of meaningful relationships, a good sense of achievement, that is my set. But what if my spouse is like, really, it needs to be a lot of positive emotions. I'm not really worried about meaning. A little bit of achievement is important. And relationships that serve the positive emotions are really important to me. But otherwise, just sort of companionship. Those are different, right? Those are really, really different. And if I'm trying to raise my children to have my goals as their goals, and my spouse is trying to raise our children to have their goals as my goals, we don't actually have a common strategy, tactics. So sometimes creating with someone is not super easy. Finding the places that you actually are aligned enough to work together can be hard. And finding a common goal can be hard. It is very easy for emotionally sensitive people to give up on relationships at this point. So I'm going to give you another piece of language, which is create from the other person. You can acknowledge that the other person is who they are. You can honor that that is where they are, that they are a human being with a ladder of inference that makes sense to them. They're not crazy. There's not something broken about the way they're thinking. You just disagree with the way they put all of that together. There's something that doesn't match with the way you walk up your ladder. So you accept this is who they are, this is what they believe, this is how they're going to act. This is how they're acting in this moment. This is what they're willing to commit to, this is what they're willing to do, and this is what they're not willing to commit to or do. And then you say, okay, what am I going to create from that? You don't have to do it with them. You can use them as the source material. Now, notice that this is different than using them. Like, you're honoring that they're a person. You're honoring that they've got their own integrity, their own sanity, their own sense of, you're just not able to be in alignment with them towards a common goal, so you can't work with them. But you can still build your thriving life from the reality that includes them being who they are. So, bunch of different tools here about being in relationship and how intensity might impact those. Food for thought. I encourage questions, and I'll see you on the next content call.